Hello, and welcome to another episode of Max Planck Florida's Neurotransmissions Podcast. I'm Joe Schumacher, joined again by Dr. Jeremy Chang. How's it going, Jeremy?
Pretty good.
We've got a really great show lined up for today. Joining us today for the first time on the podcast is Dr. Tim Harris. He's Senior Fellow at HHMI's Janelia Research Campus and a research professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Harris, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Happy to be here.
So, we love to talk technology on this podcast, how it influences the directions people take in neuroscience. But to sort of back up a little bit of where you come from and how your career has been informed, it's been very clear in a few episodes of this podcast that throughout the history of the last few decades in neuroscience, some very impactful researchers who've really charted important directions in our field all kind of originated at Bell Labs in New Jersey. And you're one of those people. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about earlier days in your research career when you were working at Bell Labs. What was the environment like? What was special about a place like Bell Labs back in the 1980s?
It was special for a reason that I think most people don't know. First of all, it was a very strongly talent-filtered pool.
Yeah.
So you did not have to worry about being the smartest person on your hall or the smartest person in your building. You needed to worry about were you the smartest person in a private office. So that sets one tone. But the thing that made it special for me was the very wide variety of science that was going on, and that much of the invention of that science was done by the people that were there. And that the groups were really small, typically one principal investigator and one assistant. And groups were never bigger. So, and there was a policy that was implemented in the 30s and 40s on purpose called the open door policy. There's a book called The Idea Factory that documents this. When I read that book, I thought, oh yeah, I noticed that culture the day I arrived. The rule at Bell Labs were, you got to talk. You cannot close your office and try and work alone. And so if somebody knocks on your door and asks, you got a minute to talk, the answer is by fiat, yes. So my favorite example of that is one day I was worrying about a really arcane thought about what happened when light was shined at really small metal particles. And I thought, if they were superconducting metals, it would be just really awesome. So there was a guy in my department that had been at Bell Labs since the late 40s. And I went down the hall and asked him, Darwin Wood, I said, Dar, do you know anybody who knows about the optical properties of superconducting metals? And he said, oh yeah, Jim Allen invented that. I thought, great, Jim's like down the hall and around the corner. Down the hall around the corner, bang on the door's open. Jim, you got a minute? Yes, I do. Well, I got
I'm
this
contractually
idea.
obligated to have a minute.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was part. So no one ever said you can't close your office door. It was in the water. Like you can't close your office door. You got to talk. And so I said, Jim, I got this great idea. There's this funny phenomenon. It works when small metal particles are illuminated with light. You get these big effects. It seems like it would just be really big in superconducting metals. And he says, oh, they're just ordinary metals. I said, really? But they're superconducting. He says, yeah, I'm sorry, but at optical frequencies, they're ordinary metals. And I thought, oh, man, it was such a good idea. And so in 15 minutes, I had a great idea. I found out who invented that. I found out it wasn't an important idea at all and went back to work.
It's a very emotional roller coaster to go on.
Well, it was the really magic thing about it is that you didn't have to think, was that really right? Like you were talking to the guy who knew as much about that as anyone alive. And so you could just take it to the bank. Mm-hmm. Okay, Jim understands what this is. So are any, so this particular phenomenon worked best with gold and silver. But they don't superconduct. But superconducting metals don't do what gold and silver does at room temperature. And so it was an example of, there was only one person out of the 1,000 people in research that I ever encountered that would only answer the very specific question you asked and wouldn't think with you. And it just made it the most interesting, challenging. I went there to survive. I thought, well, this place is like way over my head. And so I thought, well, if I work really hard, I can last 10 years before I'm burned out, and then I will have had a chance to work at Bell Labs. So one of my friends said one time, lucky for you and me, Tim, science is not an IQ test. And I thought, well, lucky for me, Alex, I think you'd do fine. But I think that science is not an IQ test. I mean, there are people who you think, my gosh, where was I standing when they were passing that kind of talent out? But science is an important thought experiment. Like, what matters? There are infinite questions. Only some set of them are worth working hard at. And so that's the issue that I think is, what question that's important is answerable in the near term. There's no point in trying to answer a question you don't have any access to.
Sure.
Like, let's try and go to Pluto, thinking, well, we can work on it. We're not going to get anywhere. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The example that I like best is that, let's assume you're a pharaoh of Egypt. I invented this when I got to Janelia because neuroscience is so hard. I thought we should just quit and wait 100 years when we're smarter. I got a lot of pushback on that. So I said, okay, how about this? Let's say you're the pharaoh of Egypt. It's 2500 BC. You got a lot of extra wheat, nothing to do. What shall we do? Well, they knew about Mars. They knew it was a planet. And they could say, wow, let's try and go to Mars. And somebody else would say, I think we should build a really big stack of rock shaped like a cone. Well, if they'd have tried to go to Mars, it would have been a pointless task. They wouldn't have made any progress, but they made some really great piles of rocks because it was feasible with the resources they had, which was labor and rocks and spare time outside of the farming season. And so I think you got to think about what's doable. What questions can you get some traction on? And then, work hard and be willing to be wrong. Think, all right, what we thought we knew, we don't. We're just not making any headway. What's plan B?
So when you're thinking about what's doable, I think a lot of what's really great about, innovative technology is that it changes the landscape of what's doable. Is part of your task to focus on an area of research that is doable in the short term? Do you also think the next step ahead and say, what doors does this open? What questions does this make available to us later? Or are you more focused on the problem that's right in front of you? I mean, are you conscious of technology in its potential to be transformative in our way of thinking? Or are you more focused on, a research program because it is doable and it's an interesting question in and of itself?
Or even, Bell Labs was a commercial entity, right? Were there any sort of considerations for
you had to make an argument that this was going to enhance the communications business. So I went to work at Bell Labs when it was Ma Bell AT&T. I was one of 1.3 million AT&T employees. The biggest company in the world at the time. I think that Foxconn is now approximately that big. But you had to make an argument, however thin. This is advancing the telephonic communications capability. So it's a bunch of material science. Some of it was pretty thin, but nonetheless. I was in a material science organization. We were trying to make stuff that could be used in a communications application. The transistor was invented there absolutely on purpose because they needed a switch. And the switches they had were vacuum tubes. And vacuum tubes fail. And so you needed a switch that didn't fail. And so it wasn't like pie in the sky physics, like we need a switch. And John Bardeen would calculate what a switch might be, and then they'd go in the lab and try and make it. And the next week they said, well, we assumed this, that doesn't appear to be true. We assumed that, it does appear to be true. Where do we go in our next iteration? And so when I think about this, I think my friends want to record as many neurons as possible. They do not have a technology that allows them to record nearly as many as they would like. So what are the available technologies? What do we know? And what are the unknowns that we can resolve to understand? Is there a path forward? And so the way I think about it is I think about, okay, what are we trying to get to? What are the unknowns to get there? And how do we understand those unknowns to find out, yes, that's a path and we should go there, or, yeah, that's just not as important as we'd hoped. And we're just not going to do it because it's not important enough for the effort. And so my usual modus operandi is to find people who I'm a measurement tool builder. And so the question is, what measurement do you want to do? I would ask people when I first got to Janelia, the HHMI investigators, this elite group of people that HHMI funds, what do you want to measure that you can't measure? Half of them told me no one had ever asked them that question.
So this is when you started at Janelia,
when I was just
basically.
Early on. What do you want to measure that you can't measure? I'll think about, do I have any ideas about how to get towards that objective? Because I would like to invent the measurement tool that's important. I have a list. You have to vet it. Biologists sometimes are really bad at picking what's important versus what their favorite hobby horse is. So that's where my judgment has to come in, thinking, yeah, I understand you want to know that, but no one else does, so I'm not going to spend. That's sort of my game plan in that space.
Backing up like kind of slightly in your career, so telecommunications, and then positions looking into biotechnology largely after that. What was the motivation with Janelia? Like this was your kind of actually your first foray into neuroscience specifically.
Yeah. So
how did you get
the lesson in this is, first of all, that don't worry about not knowing anything about what you're proposing to do.
Okay.
You can learn it.
It's very inspiring.
I started out as an analytical chemist. I went to Bell Labs. If you do measurements for a living and you're at Bell Labs, you're going to do semiconductor devices and materials. So I did that for a while. I became a semiconductor physicist after a fashion. Many people assume I'm a physicist by training. One of my friends, Louis Bruce, had just invented something that are now called quantum dots. They were pretty crummy at the time. He came to my lab and said, I have these. I'd like to try and understand them. Your equipment seems to be all right. It's a classic Bell Labs thing, that you always go look for help because you don't have a big group. And so I thought, well, that's fun. And we were struggling with the fact that in quantum dots, their size determines what they do. And they're not molecules, so they're all different sizes. And so they're just a heterogeneous mess. So somewhere in the late 80s, I thought, we'll do them one at a time. We'll do them one at a time, and then heterogeneity doesn't matter. Well, you can calculate the signal from this is the classic problem. Calculate the signal. Signal's big enough. What's the background? Are we trying to do astronomy in the daytime, or are we trying to do astronomy at night? Astronomy at night's pretty easy. Astronomy in the daytime is really hard. So we set out to understand, if you wanted to look at a quantum dot one at a time, could you get the background low enough to see one? We knew what we were looking for. Interesting enough, with the history of Max Planck, Erwin Neher told me a very similar story about looking at single ion channels. They knew what the noise was in a multi-ion channel patch signal, so they knew the magnitude of the signal they were looking for. The question is, could you see it in the absence? And so I was really stunned at how similar our thinking was. Well, Eric Bedzig was there at the time. I didn't know him, and so I had a new postdoc, and he came to me with a paper that showed an exotic form of optical microscopy that would have hypothetically made a low background. So I looked at it and I thought, man, this looks really hard. Like, let's do an easier experiment. A couple of months later, he discovered that the guy who wrote those papers was down the hall and around the corner. So I said, let's go see him, like immediately, bang on the door. Like, hi, you don't know us. We're interested in this. He was trying to build a transmission microscope that scanned really fast. I said, nobody cares. That is in fact turned out to be true. But I said, I'll sit in one place all day, but I want to do one. He and my postdoc invented a new technology, 10,000 times better than the one he had in hand. That is the technology that allowed him to image single quantum dots, and that was second. The first was single molecules. The first single molecule image ever done by Eric Bedzig at Bell Labs. He was smart enough to figure out how to turn it into a microscopy project and won a Nobel Prize. Eventually, we did it. We used it to do single quantum dots and discovered they blinked. We didn't know they blinked until we saw them one at a time. And so it's the classic case in my mind of, okay, you know half of the answer. You know what you want to do and why. You have to go find the second half of the answer. Can you manage the background? It turned out that the background management problem was just not a big deal, and we should have not gone into exotic microscopy, but it all was very fun in the end. Eric's a really fun colleague to be around, and so nobody suffered from the diversion we took. But that's an example. You know something, you know what you want to do and why, and then you have to knock down the unknowns to ask, can I get there?
Yeah. And so, the sort of segue then after working on DNA sequencing and other technologies specifically into neuroscience, what was the motivation with Janelia?
Well, threefold. One is I was working at a biotech that I thought was going to crash.
Okay, good start.
So I thought, these guys are not smart enough to turn this into a business. And so we're going to crash. And so I thought, I don't want to be part of that crash. And so I thought, okay, I need a new job. What should I do? I had left solid-state physics to life science on purpose because I thought, look, I'm not good at making stuff. I'm good at making measurements, and so I want to go where measurements are the primary problem. That's biology. The stuff is already there. You need measurements.
That's interesting. I feel like a lot of theoretical physicists also move into into neuroscience specifically around these same timeframes, but for slightly different reasons. A lot of people with chemistry and physics backgrounds find something tractable in neuroscience, and for you, it's actually measurement. It's not building necessarily theoretical frameworks to explain dynamics or dynamical systems. It's more an application of
neuroscience is really hard. You know, I was arguing, let's give it up for a century and see if, and so it's a measurement limited problem in every way. And so I had to make the bet that, look, my measurement capabilities are good enough that we can make some headway here. It's not Egyptians trying to go to Mars. It's, meaningful progress. And so I knew as much neuroscience as you learn by reading the gossip pages of Science and Nature. I mean, that is an absolute truth. You got to be willing to ask bad questions. You got to be willing, people think, God, how can you be that ignorant? I'm thinking, I'm sorry, I am. That's where we are. I learned somewhere along my career to ask good questions fairly early in my literacy possibilities. And so I don't know how or when I gained that. I take no credit for it.
As part of it just not being afraid to ask silly questions?
You got to... I like to tell this story. I was in high school in something that would have been kind of honors chemistry at the time. We didn't use those terms. I'm really old. And so we were in this class of 20-ish people, and the instructor said, okay, did everybody understand that? And we all sat there like lumps. And he said, look, I know you all didn't understand that, so you have two choices. You can either look ignorant or be ignorant. I raised my hand. I'd rather look ignorant than be ignorant. A really important lesson that I have remembered, it doesn't matter if you look ignorant, if you are.
Because you can fix being
ignorant. You can fix being ignorant.
Yeah.
That's my career advice. Fix being ignorant.
That's great.
You'll get there.
It's very succinct, and I feel like it applies to every domain of science in general. So, you mentioned when you get to Janelia, you ask your colleagues, what is something you wish you could measure? And they're like, nobody's ever asked me that before. I'm assuming that along the way, this translates into the early ideas for your Neuropixels probes. What were some of the feedback you were getting from colleagues at the time in terms of, limitations in the capacity of like the numbers of contacts and things like that?
So it's really straightforward. I mean, neuroscience is about activity and anatomy. And so, they wanted us to fix both. Can you teach us the anatomy? And can you teach us the activity? So they would tell you, here we are in anatomy. It's a really bad space. we did some work that turned out to be not as important as we had hoped. I mean, people ask us, make this microscope, it will help us do anatomy. I was a microscope engineer until I got to Janelia. And so that turned out to have less impact than I thought, because making and labeling the sample was harder than using the microscope. And microscope worked fine. It was making the sample that was hard.
That's even true today, even with a lot of like the super resolution techniques, is like it's labeling limited at this point. We can see the smallest stuff we ever care to see, but how do you specifically label the cristae of the mitochondria?
Yeah, exactly. Like and so, just completely, vicariously for me is that Dima Rinberg, who's now at NYU, was the group leader then at Janelia, and Albert Lee came to me and said, we have these things, they're called silicon probes, they have, 4 channels. We need way more capacity. I had never heard of these things. I looked at the technology. It was stunningly primitive. In 2009, it was 60s fabrication technology, almost 50 years old. And so I thought, well, look, I'm not a semiconductor engineer, but I think we can do a little better than this. And so I set out to make the probes that Hidehiko uses here. It took me a few iterations to get there. One of the nice things about Janelia is you got enough money that if the first time it doesn't work and the second time it doesn't work, you get a third try. But it became clear fairly early on that as far as I was likely able to go, it was still not what we really needed. What we really needed was hundreds of channels, not tens. Thousands would be better, but at least hundreds. And so while I was finishing up I'm going to draw the line here, I'm going to make a 64-channel device because it just doesn't make sense to go further with the capacity I have access to. There are real microelectronics companies in the world. They make stuff that is radically more complicated than I can access. And so I went, look, I do what engineers do. I wrote a specification. I want a device this big. It has to have this noise level. It has to have this size, and went around trying to find someone who could make it. And I ran almost accidentally across this organization in Belgium called IMEC. And they were trying to make something that was relevant to neuroscience research and failing. And so I walk in the door. This is another lesson in life. I walk in the door with HHMI written on my forehead. Well, look, brands matter, like Bell Labs.
Yeah.
Like brand, if you call somebody up and you're just the rookiest scientist possible, if you say, this is Tim Harris from Bell Labs, you're probably going to get your call answered.
That's nice.
Well, if you're Tim Harris from HHMI and you walk into IMEC, you're saying, look, I'm trying to get someone to build a neuroscience tool for me. And the management says, well, we've been trying for the last 5 years and no one seems to care about what we build. Their notion is, well, this guy's from HHMI. Maybe he knows what's worth doing. And so you at least get a hearing. And I explained what I wanted and why. And the other thing that's important in my career track about being at biotech startups is that biotech startups, your job is to spend money and buy speed. Buy speed. Speed is really critical. And so, don't try one thing, try 3 things. Because if the first one fails, you don't want to have the second one waiting in line. You want to have it running in parallel. And so you buy speed. And so I thought, so these guys came back to me with a proposal after some iterations and said, okay, we can do this for you, $5.5 million. And that was at the time just a ridiculous ask in a neuroscience tool context, but it was a perfectly reasonable number in a biotech startup environment. So I just went down to my boss and said, boss, I need $5.5 million. And, I was simply willing to say that because I was convinced that it would be a transformational tool if it could be made. Because they were already doing something that was almost just like that. It just needed to have more capacity. It wasn't I needed to invent the car. I needed to invent one that went faster. We already had the thing we wanted to do. We understood it. The data digestion was not going to scale very well, but it was all there. It just needed to be more. So I went out to look for more.
So how hard was it to convince was there a divergence in how hard it was to convince the neuroscientists in terms of the usefulness of this technique versus the people that would fund this?
So there's some really interesting recollections in that regard. So when this was all ready, and I told my boss, look, I have this confidential proposal that I need to tell the institute about. 100 people came, and I walked them through This is what I want to make, and I need this budget to make it. 100 people in the room, 98 of them are neuroscientists. They would say, science fiction. You will never get that to work. 2 of them were former semiconductor engineers. Their question was, what's hard about that? Just again, this very weird broad background that I bring to the table is that you can talk to both communities if you learn their language. So I didn't know the neuroscience language when I got to Janelia, but you can learn it.
Sure.
And so, you can say, well, I know you guys are skeptical, but I know enough to know the semiconductor engineers think this is a straightforward thing. It's expensive to do development. It's not expensive to make once the development's done. And so I convinced the bosses, look, I think this is doable. My boss told me, if you think it's that important, you should be able to find a partner. I told the story at my talk.
Yeah, it's actually a great story.
So I think this is, again, one of these perspective things, is that the person in the next door office to mine at the time was Sidney Brenner, who's no longer with us. Sidney was just a spectacularly good scientist. He was the head of one of the most famous laboratories in the world at the time, the MRC at Cambridge University. He was the boss of Frederick Sanger until a couple of years ago, the only person who had ever won 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry. So Sidney was unintimidated by risk. So he thought, this has Janelia written all over it, Tim. I said, well, Sidney, Jerry thinks I need a partner. And he says, I got to go to MIT tomorrow. I'll be back on Friday. Let's talk about it. So he goes to MIT, he comes back. He says, Christoph Koch announced a big project at the Allen Institute. He's moving there. I asked him, what are you going to do for a probe? He said, I need a probe. He says, you should call Christoph, Tim. So I called Christoph. Christoph says, I think I could pay for a third. I don't think I can pay for half. So I thought, great, one partner is infinitely better than 0 partners. So it took 9 months to get the rest of the money. But again, this is an example of, so we went to the UK. It turns out that was a Janelia guy that had moved to the Wellcome Trust. He invited me to come and pitch to them. There's a second smaller charity called the Gatsby Foundation. If you've ever been to the UK, you might have been to a Sainsbury grocery store. The Gatsby Foundation is the property of David Sainsbury, Lord Sainsbury of Turville. He was the science minister in some Labour government a while ago. And so anyway, he had a neuroscience thread. And so when we gave the pitch there, his neuroscience liaison came out and said, I'm in for £500,000. I don't care what Wellcome does. And so this is, I think, a wise life lesson. So now you got HHMI, you got the Allen Institute, you got the Gatsby Foundation. It's really tough to say you don't want to join that club. Yeah, they're not good enough for me. It's just not going to work. And
Branding.
So it took a while to get over because it's kind of a bureaucratic organization, the Wellcome Trust, although they tell me they're the least bureaucratic organization in the UK. Pretty frightening thought. But the point was that sort of community credibility generated $5.5 million in funding and $5.5 million to send to IMAC. I mean, HHMI funded me and my group to do the testing and development, write software. The Wellcome funded, the people at UCL and John O'Keefe's lab to do their part, and Allen put up their money themselves besides sending a good chunk to IMEC, and so it was a budget that would not have been considered feasible for NIH grants, for example. But nothing is rewarded like success, and so we were quite conservative about the technology. We knew, look, we're not going to get a second bite at the apple if this flops.
Right.
And so it was basically a cut and paste electronics design. We didn't try and make it too small. We didn't try to make it too fancy. We had some noise specs that we had to meet. And so it turned out to work more than good enough, and that gives you a second go. Okay, you guys, now that we have this one, it works great. We think we can make it a third the size or maybe less. And give it some more shanks so it's better for mice. And so that was a much less difficult argument.
And NeuroPixel 1.0 was a huge hit. I mean, people were, it reminded me of when optogenetics became widely available and viable. It's just something that you can pick up off the shelf and immediately see a benefit to
I think without being arrogant, people have said, look, this is like optogenetics. It's become the dominant technology in the space. And it's because it's easy and purchasable.
Right.
You just order it. You plug it in.
You don't have to develop yourself. You don't have to follow a recipe. You can get a tool and you can put it in the brain.
In half an hour, you can be recording neurons.
So in NeuroPixel 1.0, describe the configuration. It's a silicon probe, single shank.
Right.
And it has how many contacts?
It has just under 1,000 on 10 millimeters of shank.
And at the time, competing products on the market might have had
16.
64, maybe
64
16.
was the state of the art that came from my lab.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Elsewhere, it was 16.
Commercially available.
Commercially available.
And maybe you'd get 2 to get 32 channels.
Yeah, exactly.
Or something like that.
And
quite a leap forward.
Most of an order of magnitude.
Before sort of thinking about what are some of the other technological, as you said, you can start thinking about 2.0, you can start thinking about other more application-specific configurations. What out the gate or in the last few years have been some of the most surprising or most exciting directions people have taken the technology in your perspective?
Well, I think the question is, where in the brain does that happen?
Mm-hmm.
That means that if you want to answer that question, you have to record brain-wide and by some definition. There have been a few papers that have made that argument. They do it serially. They do the experiment over and over and over and over again, and they record, they try and make a really reproducible experiment, and then they record all over the brain during that experiment, and then they make the assertion, this working memory happens in anterior cingulate cortex, because if we silence it, you can't remember, except for it turns out that if you silence one side, the other side takes over, so you've got to silence both sides or it doesn't, But on the other hand, if you record without silencing anything, you only see activity in one side. So how the brain knows turn on the other side because I'm having trouble over here is a little mysterious,
Mm-hmm.
but nonetheless, and so it has been these attempts at brain-wide surveys that are pretty arduous, serially, and I'm the author on at least one of them, and it's really first-rate work, but it is really tedious, months and months and months of data acquisition, and the obvious thing, if you're a technologist saying, look, we want to short circuit that, we want to do them all at once to make sure that the synchrony that you really would like to know, what's in the back of the brain happening within a few milliseconds of what's in the front of the brain, you can't answer that question with a serial recording. If you can record brain-wide, then you get the answer to that question. And so what I like to tell people is I'm trying to enable brain-wide recording. Brain-wide would be, all the neurons all the time and you can't do that. But the idea is at least three-dimensionally 30 identifiable brain regions simultaneously, maybe more. That at a scale that it would have been unfair to say brain-wide before that.
And you're getting that brain-wide because of the length of the NeuroPixel probe.
We just have channel capacity now. Is that in the NeuroPixel 2 probe, you have 4 shanks, so you get more tissue coverage. Mm-hmm. It's got 5,000 sites instead of 1,000. But you still only have 384 channels, and so you get 700 microns on each of 4 shanks. Well, now if you want to do the whole depth of the brain, it takes 8 steps to walk that of a mouse, to walk that 700 microns up from the bottom of the brain to the top of the cortex.
And each shank is basically like a small, tiny needle with
Each shank is a needle that's 70 microns wide and 23 microns thick. And it's got 1,280 sites on it. There are switches under every site, so you get to choose which of those 1,280 you record from. There are only 384 wires out of a shank, so you can't put more than 384 channels on any one shank. And so since it's a 384 channel probe, if you want, you can put all of your channels on one shank and ignore the other 3 shanks. That's a doable experiment. The point of the latest probe was, look, we'd like to record from the whole depth at one go.
Right.
And how much capacity you need for that? And the answer is somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 sites on a shank. Mm-hmm. So we decided, all right, 1536 is a nice round number. We're going to make a 1536 channel probe. We're going to make it small enough that you can put at least 2, probably 4 on a freely moving mouse. And then but the real reason behind the technology of the current NeuroPixels that I'm working on is that these are analog circuits, like the analog parts of your cell phone. And analog circuits technology plateaued about 15 years ago at a specific technology. And making it smaller doesn't work because it gets too noisy. So these are really, really good quality amplifiers that are in NeuroPixels probes. And so the argument I made to the NIH, who funded this project, was, look, we know where the last chapter of this book is. We might as well just skip the intermediate stuff and just get there, and then we're done. And we will engineer it so that it's reusable. And so that's how the current NeuroPixel project got designed, is because there was an obvious endpoint. And I don't think I know of a way to do, another factor of 3 or 5. I mean, you might do 20%, but 20% is not worth $5 million of engineering R&D. I think we're where we're going to get for the moment, and now we have to get better at using them.
And then if you think about basically, continuous contacts, like if you want to think about the next sci-fi version of what you could do with like electrophysiology, maybe that's the time you say, well, let's wait 100 years and we'll revisit it. One thing that really stuck out to me was the amount of data you're collecting in per minute, basically. And so I think the ballpark figure for a NeuroPixel 2 recording over an hour is something about 2 terabytes of raw data.
So that's for the new one.
That's for the newest one.
The old ones are, many tens of gigs. So one of the NeuroPixels that are about to be launched generates about a half a terabyte an hour. And so we're thinking about, 4 to 8 probe experiments, so 2 to 4 terabytes an hour. You record 3 days a week, a couple hours a day.
It adds up. Much as you might be a hero in the neuroscience community, are you like a villain in the IT department community? So have you seen people have to make new types of accommodations for the type of data infrastructure they have to support this type of technology?
Well, the guy who built Janelia, Jerry Rubin, complained that he had spent 2 to 4% of a very large budget every year from day one on storage.
Yeah.
On storage, because if you think NeuroPixels are bad, look at high-speed imaging.
Oh yeah,
I mean it's really
voltage
bad.
Imaging.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Yeah.
And so we're not the worst offenders in the building, but nonetheless, it is I used to think about, I know how to do lossless compression of a factor of 2, but who cares? But if you got 10 terabytes, 5 terabytes is better. I mean, there is a really big cost difference when you're talking 2x at those kinds of volumes. We're thinking hard about, can we compress the data 10x and actually retain quantitatively valid answers? The only way to do that is to try it out and ask what's the before compression answer and the after compression answer. If we want to build wireless systems, compression might be either absolutely required or extremely handy, one of the two.
Yeah.
We're worried. I mean, it's one of the things that are ongoing right now is how do we create a tractable data volume in order to advantage the future? Are there just raw storage issues or, wireless issues or, 18,000 channel rats are just going to become completely out of control. And so I think there's a whole bunch of field work to do in order to make this new device, which is kind of plateaued against a technology barrier, to make it tractably usable for everyone. Mm-hmm. The very best, richest labs can always wangle a way to do it. But I think that, the community has put a lot of money behind me to make these devices, and you want them to have the broadest advantage possible. You want to build fancy roads where only 3 people have cars. And so our current project is to ask how to make this absolutely usable for a second-year graduate student at a pretty good school.
That's great. Yeah.
So what exactly are the things that you're trying to build that would allow that user to use your systems?
So they fall into a few categories. One is this, surgery of too many probes. I mean, that it takes some hours to do this for one, and if you're going to try and do 8, the people that I know that have done 8 said it took of order 15 to 18 hours. That is not a one-person job if you're me. Mm-hmm. And so the people that have done it well have done it in teams and so we want to speed it up so that it's really, really reliable, as good as it can be in 8 hours for one person. The second thing is this data digestion problem. You now have so much data you cannot inspect it. You have to create automated tools that you can sample it and ask it, look, did anything go off the rails? But mostly, you have to trust the automated outcomes. And so we're building tools to do automated data digestion where it's historically been done with manual visual curation, neuron by neuron. And so we're trying to figure out how to quantify that so you can say, this is a 9.0 neuron and that's an 8.8 neuron and this is a 5.5 neuron.
Mm-hmm. Like in terms of single unit isolation and that sort of
just thing. How much you should rely on those spikes being the full reported activity of that cell. Do you have ones that don't belong? Do you have ones that are missing?
Yeah.
So coming straight out of the neuropixel, you're getting this raw signal of the voltage off of each pad, and then you're creating these tools that are allowing you to take those signals to find individual neurons.
Yeah, so what neuroscientists want is a time history of the activity of every neuron in the space. Mm-hmm. When did they fire? Because they're digital devices, they go bang. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, when did they go bang? And when did they go bang relative to the other neurons in the system? And so in the end, you want accurate spike time histories of each neuron isolated from all its neighbors. That's what I can't defend absolutely that as being the most important information, but a vast majority of my neuroscience friends tell me that's the most important information, and so I have to go with it.
Yeah, that's our current assumption, yeah. Well, that's fantastic. I think, one thing that you emphasize is there are a lot of directions you can take this technology for specific applications. For instance, for a very thick cortex, if you wanted to, record from across all cortical layers, you need a really long probe. If you wanted to be able to have some kind of in real time verification that you're recording from the same type of cell that you think you are, it's a cell that's optogenetically tagged in a genetically specific way, you can integrate optical stimulation along the fibers of the probes of the Neuropixel probe. What are some of the sort of dream directions you hope to take this technology into the future?
Well, they can be dreams. What people want is I didn't put it on my list, but it's all of the activity all the time identified by neuron type. Mm-hmm. Now, neuron type is a fight all by itself.
There's many ways to say neuron type.
We used to have this argument at Janelia early on, and finally Jerry Rubin just said, look, I will take two positions. I will take there are two kinds of neurons. There are two kinds of cells in the brain, neurons and glia. Yeah. And then I will take the position there are as many neuron types as there are neurons.
Right. Yeah.
and so it's a bit of a there are clearly important classes of neurons, like pyramidal cells are self-similar, but there are different classes of pyramidal neurons. There are inhibitory neurons and there are excitatory neurons. So you would love to know that without having to do any extra work. So one of the things we tried to do with the very high density probe was to identify the neuron type based on just the electrophysiology information itself. There's a preprint about this. And the answer is you get about it 2/3 of the time correct and about 1/3 of the time not. If we could think of a way to do that without having to do optical experiments with genetic labeling. These are really powerful tools, but genetically labeling gives you maybe 2 channels of color. And if you think, okay, there are 100, people just say this, there are 100 neuron types in the cortex. So are you gonna do 100 different optical labeling experiments in order to understand which of those 100 neuron types are part of your experiment? That would be a career that one might choose. It's not the one that I would choose. But it's an incredibly complicated biological space. And so the struggle to me in neuroscience is always which question are we able to answer now that gives us the most progress? And which ones should we leave aside for now because it's just too slow going?
Because we're still, pharaohs with piles of rocks.
I hate to denigrate some really, really smart people, but...
I think life is not as exciting as it could be if there's not some other evolution of our thinking or other, potential that's down the line that we haven't gotten to yet. We might in ancient Egypt not have thought about how to get to Mars, but hopefully there's an equivalent today that 1,000 years from now people will look back on and feel similarly about. And even in neuroscience, hopefully we're going to run out of stuff to do if we've really not just scratched the surface at this point, right?
Even if I was young, I wouldn't be worried about running out of stuff to do in neuroscience. It is really hard. Yeah. It's really complicated. And so, I used to tell people, look, we know less than 1% of what we need to know about a mammalian neural system. My friend Eve Marder at Brandeis University will tell me she studies this funny neural system called the somatogastric ganglion in lobsters. Lobster stomachs have muscles and 27 neurons that contract the muscles and grind up the food. And so Eve, in her system, knows where every synapse in those 27 neurons is. Absolute accurate connectivity, and it will change state without her understanding why. And that's because there are molecules that are changing the gain between those neurons and so she needs, chemical information about this 27 neuron system. And, we're thinking we're worrying about mice with 100 million neurons. And so it is really complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're just about out of time. Dr. Harris, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. It was a really great overview of the genesis of this really transformative technology. So we really appreciate you sharing your time with us today.
My pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Today, we have an important announcement. You've just listened to the 99th episode of our podcast, which means we are approaching a huge milestone for Neurotransmissions. We will be airing our 100th episode next month. We're very excited to bring you another set of interviews with prominent neuroscientists talking about the state of the art of our field. I'm here to announce today that this will be my last episode of Neurotransmissions. That being the 100th episode will be my last episode. So while this will be the end of the road for me and the podcast will be going on hiatus, there will always be this sort of historical document of all the other 100 episodes or so of our podcast that we've aired over time that people can go back to and think of sort of as a time capsule, the last 10 years of neuroscience. There have been so many fundamental changes in how we approach our work, amazing new technologies that have come out. And our podcast will be posted indefinitely so that everybody can go back and listen to these episodes if they want. I can't believe we're at 100 episodes, honestly. I don't know what powered it through, except for the fact that we've had you, our dedicated listeners, engaging with us over the last several years. Thank you to all the researchers who have come through and shared their stories with us and their research careers. Think of the countless grad students and postdocs that you've inspired with your work to carry their work forward into the future. That ultimately was the mission statement of our podcast. Share great neuroscience stories and career advice for early stage investigators. And I think we've done that very well. Again, thank you to everyone who is ever a guest on this podcast. And thank you especially to you, the listener, for tuning in. It's been an incredible privilege to guide this podcast from start till now, and I'm looking forward to what MPFI has for this podcast in the future. So stay tuned. We have one more episode coming at you, and I hope you enjoy it. Take care.